How did we get here? The path to economic enslavement. The emergence of this new form of economic servitude, where millions work tirelessly but remain financially trapped, is not an accident. It is the result of decades of systemic changes, policy decisions, and unchecked greed. Understanding how we arrived at this stage requires examining the historical, economic, and political forces that shaped the current system. 1. The shift to neoliberal economics. In the late 20th century, many governments embraced neoliberal economic policies, emphasizing deregulation, privatization, and free markets. While these policies were sold as the path to economic growth, they came with significant downsides. Deregulation allowed corporations to prioritize profits over social responsibility, often at the expense of workers and consumers. Privatization of essential services, such as healthcare, education, and utilities, turned public goods into commodities, driving up costs. Weakened labor protections dismantled unions and collective bargaining, leaving workers with little power to demand fair wages or better working conditions. This economic philosophy shifted wealth and power from the working class to corporations and the ultra-wealthy, setting the stage for today's inequality. 2. Globalization and outsourcing. Globalization, while opening markets and creating opportunities for some, has had devastating consequences for the working class in developed and developing nations alike. Outsourcing of manufacturing and service jobs to countries with cheaper labor led to the decline of well-paying jobs in industrialized nations. In developing nations, global supply chains often exploit workers in sweatshops and factories, paying wages that barely cover basic living expenses. The race to the bottom. To remain competitive, companies cut costs wherever possible, often at the expense of wages, benefits, and job security. This global economic system prioritizes corporate profits over the well-being of workers, leaving millions in precarious conditions. 3. Stagnant wages amid rising productivity. Since the 1970s, worker productivity has skyrocketed, but wages have remained stagnant. This disconnect can be attributed to corporate greed. Profits generated from increased productivity have been funneled to executives and shareholders rather than workers. Union decline. The weakening of labor unions has reduced workers' bargaining power, allowing employers to suppress wages. Automation. Technological advancements have replaced many jobs, leaving workers with fewer opportunities and forcing them to accept lower wages. As a result, even as economies grow, the benefits are concentrated at the top, leaving the majority of workers struggling to keep up. 4. The financialization of the economy. In recent decades, the economy has shifted from producing goods and services to generating profits through financial instruments. The rise of Wall Street-style capitalism has prioritized shareholder value. Corporations now focus on delivering short-term returns to shareholders rather than long-term investments in employees or communities. Created housing and debt crises. Speculation in housing markets and predatory lending practices have inflated costs and trapped millions in debt. Exacerbated inequality. Wealth generated in financial markets disproportionately benefits the wealthy who own the majority of stocks and investments. This financialization has turned essential needs like housing and healthcare into speculative assets, driving prices higher and leaving many unable to afford them. 5. Weak government policies and corporate influence. Governments bear significant responsibility for failing to protect their citizens from economic exploitation. Key issues include tax cuts for the wealthy. Decades of tax cuts for corporations and the rich have reduced public revenues, leading to underfunded social programs. Regulatory capture. Corporations have used lobbying and campaign donations to influence policy, ensuring regulations favor their interests over those of workers. Inadequate social safety nets. Many governments have failed to provide robust welfare programs, leaving the poor and working class vulnerable to economic shocks. This lack of oversight has allowed corporations to engage in profiteering and price gouging with little accountability. 6. Inflation fueled by crisis profiteering. Recent global crises, such as the COVID-19 pandemic and supply chain disruptions, have exposed how corporations exploit crises to maximize profits. Supply chain disruptions. While some price increases were justified by rising costs, many companies used the crisis as an excuse to raise prices far beyond what was necessary. Energy inflation. Geopolitical events, such as the war in Ukraine, have driven up energy prices, but oil companies have simultaneously reported record profits. Consolidation of power. Monopolistic corporations dominate industries like food, energy, and healthcare, reducing competition and enabling price manipulation. These practices have turned temporary crises into long-term financial burdens for ordinary people. 7. Cultural normalization of overwork. The cultural narrative that hard work leads to success has been weaponized to justify economic inequality. Society often blames individuals for their financial struggles rather than addressing systemic issues. Hustle culture. The glorification of overwork has convinced many that working multiple jobs is a badge of honor rather than a symptom of a broken system. Shaming the poor. Narratives about lazy or irresponsible poor people distract from the systemic forces that keep them in poverty. Erosion of work-life balance. As wages stagnate, workers feel compelled to take on more hours or side hustles just to survive, sacrificing their health and relationships. This cultural shift reinforces economic servitude, making it harder for workers to demand systemic change. 8. A system designed to perpetuate inequality. Ultimately, the system we live in was built to prioritize profits over people. The mechanisms that perpetuate economic slavery, deregulation, corporate greed, stagnant wages, and financialization are not accidental. They are the result of deliberate choices by those in power to concentrate wealth and maintain control. Conclusion: the need for structural change. The current state of economic servitude is the product of decades of systemic exploitation. To escape this cycle, we must demand structural reforms that prioritize human dignity over corporate profits. This includes rethinking labor laws, strengthening social safety nets, and addressing the root causes of inequality. Until we confront these underlying forces, millions will remain shackled by a system that promises prosperity but delivers only despair. The time for change